Derek, then you can decide later on what you want to do with this. Like if you want us to keep this private, if you're okay with us making the recording public,
You
it's
can
up to
make it public. I can go ahead and tell you that right now. That's fine.
you. Okay, great. Uh, okay, man, the floor is yours. Thank you so much for joining us. It was a long time coming since we said like we would have you over, but then scheduling issues happened. But really glad we're doing this now. Really curious also to why you chose to speak about something you already told us you are kind of uh, have an ambivalent relationship to say the least.
Yes, I mean that question actually is a good way to start us off. So one of the things about dealing with Christopher Lasch um, is that he's a social historian and a cultural historian. And it shows up that he has a familiarity with Marxism. It definitely informs his work, but properly speaking, his introduction to Marxism is very much influenced by the Baran and Sweezy period, meaning that he doesn't think Marxist categories of economics are actually all that useful, and that was considered de rigueur in academia at the time amongst most Marxists. The failure of either a revolution or another depression in the early 1950s, as predicted by Trotsky, Stalin, um, the Grossmanites, etc., Paul Matic, led to a general kind of distrust, even amongst those who were sympathetic to Marxism, to use Marxist economic categories. Now, I bring that up in a chapter on psychoanalysis because I'm going to give you some background context for why Lasch himself thought he had to turn to psychoanalysis to explain what happened in the New Left. During the reception of his fifth book, Haven in a Heartless World, which was his critique of 70s feminism and the redefinition of familiar life, that he thought he was writing from a working class sympathetic quasi-Marxist point of view. He felt like he did not have the answers for all the shifts in the culture around the question. And in 1980s interviews on the topic, he said he realized he had to go back into psychology and specifically into psychoanalysis to answer the problem that he could not answer merely doing an ideological and material history of the left in the United States, which was the project of his first four books. His first four books, American Liberals and the Russian Revolution, The Agony of the American Left, The New Intellectuals, no, the New Radicalism, excuse me, which is about intellectuals, and from Haven and A World of Nations were all written basically as pretty much historiographic approaches to the history of the American left, trying to remind them of the trends that seemed to go further back in US history than was understood by the leftists themselves. So he was looking at the history of, say, the early progressive movement, 19th century feminism, the temperance movement, early bourgeois radicalism in America, the socialist movement, etc., the black nationalist movement, and trying to expose that the problems that they saw that were emerging in the 60s were already there even before, say, the Marxification or Europeanization of the American left. But around the beginning of the 70s, he just felt like he couldn't explain that on those terms alone. He had been influenced by the Frankfurt School, but essentially rejected their rejection of the working class and figured that he needed to have a more robust understanding of psychoanalysis to actually be able to develop a theory of what was going on. Now, this leads to the famous book, the one that almost everyone's read. And it goes mostly off of social descriptivism. It reads a lot more like, in many ways, his prior books on social history and intellectual genealogy, except that you begin to see in this book a conception of narcissism coming out of psychoanalysis, primarily focusing on Freud and Kohut, actually, in this book. And trying to tie that in to the winding down of the Fordist system, which he can tell is winding down, but he can't really tell where it's going. All right. This book goes ape busters, but he doesn't like the reception to it. He feels like that people don't actually understand what he's trying to get to, trying to tie in a kind of social psychoanalysis into a cultural and political understanding of where the American political culture had gone, and he feels like people are reading it as too moralistic. So then he writes this book, which unfortunately almost no one has read. And while, just to point this out, there are many editions of this guy, you still have to get the 1984 printing of this one. All right. Which is a shame, because in chapters, I didn't have you read but one of them, but chapters 5, 6, and 7, he actually goes into specifically the history of psychoanalysis and how he thinks the schools of psychoanalysis that are influencing them clarify the question. Now, unfortunately, however, you have to read both the culture of narcissism and the minimal self together to really be able to connect the psychoanalytic trends that he's tying in together in a history and the political economic ones, because he doesn't necessarily always make the connection for you. And that's one of the things we're going to talk about today in the chapter that I had you read, which is really about what he sees as the psychoanalytic trends that become dominant in America amongst liberal circles in a Fordist and the end of Fordist, or beginnings of a post-Fordist age. But this is before we get to neoliberalism, which he is concerned about, but does not articulate as neoliberalism until a later book. His writings in the mid-1980s up to 1983, I mean, not up to 1988, excuse me, really make his concerns with neoliberalism clearer, but he sees the breakdown of Fordism and the breakdown of both behavioristic and humanistic psychology as related to that. Another thing that shifts between the two books here is, in this book, he sees the culture of narcissism as primary manifestation of secondary narcissism, of the narcissism of identifying society and the workplace with yourself, living through that. Whereas in this book, he becomes concerned with primary narcissism, which is the inability to distinguish a self separate from other altogether. And he ties this to the removal of sexual family norms. Now, one of the things that's interesting that you guys might be interested in knowing, my both ambivalence about psychoanalysis and my particular ambivalence about Lacanianism, is there's no Lacan in this book from what I can find. In fact, his absence is screaming. And we can talk about why that might be later, because Lasch is pulling a lot from French psychoanalysis, particularly in chapter 5, which I didn't have you read. Sorry about that. But he's pulling from the Chassuget, Smergel, Grunberger schools of psychoanalysis in France, not the Lacanian ones, which is kind of a glaring and screaming reference, because we do know that he was familiar with other forms of French theory like Debord, Althusser, etc. So that gap is interesting, and I don't entirely know what to make of it, but it's something I noticed when I was reviewing this for trying to interpret why Lasch thought psychoanalysis was an answer to his question. He also is highly critical of revisions of psychoanalysis. And again, Lacan's missing here, but he goes after Adler, Jung, and let's see who else. And the ego psychologists, specifically Hartman, at the end of the book. And then later on, he talks about Norman O'Brien, both praising him and condemning him in the last part of the book. And again, I didn't have you read that chapter about the New Left. So we're kind of left here with a picture of the therapeutic emerging out of psychoanalysis, but according to Lasch, being co-opted into a kind of managerial liberalism. He almost seems to praise behavioralism for just being honest about its anti-democratic tendencies and its ability to want to abolish politics altogether and to abolish history altogether, which is something that he sees as a virtue of classical psychoanalysis, that it does not want to abolish history and it does not want to get rid of political struggle. But he implies strongly that this correlates with the Fordist mindset, a mindset of technical management, and that this actually stems from an expansion and a beginning of the end of the factory system. Like, he definitely strongly relates the two as part of the reason why there's an attempt to remove psychic struggle from the plane of everyday life for most people. What is interesting in these chapters, then, though, is that he also thinks that class analysis doesn't really address this. He vaguely notions at the beginning of chapter 6 that maybe some leftists are actually closer to the liberal managerial position, but doesn't really go into that, nor does he, despite being heavily focused on the working class in most of his work, really tie into working class life here and how it relates to psychoanalysis. And this makes his position a little bit harder to ascertain as to what he actually thinks is going on with psychic devastation in specific in regards to the working class. Although he talks about the tendencies of intellectuals and people removed from class relations and their psychic concerns being generalized to society through media and through schooling. But he doesn't go into how this is happening beyond that. Which means that psychic struggle, but not so much class struggle, is put first and foremost in his analysis here. This is interesting, and it's also interesting to me because he is not and never really did get clinical psychoanalytic training. He approaches the question as a historian approaches the question, I think. I mean, you guys can talk to me about whether or not you think that's true, but his descriptions of the relationships and implications of the psychological theory seem very much put in a historical mode. And that mode, in and of itself, seems to deal with psychoanalysis in a kind of paradoxical way, in which Freudian psychoanalytic insights are treated as almost transhistorical, but that our ability to access them is very much limited by our political economy. And while at first that doesn't seem contradictory, when you think about it kind of deeply, it's like, well, why would you be able to still access this if you can't based on political economy? You get into a kind of feedback loop problem. And what Lasch wants becomes unclear the more you read this book. So how does one abolish the culture of narcissism, which he thinks is to talk about the difference between roles of the sexes, although he says sexual egalitarianism is perfectly desirable and should be maintained. And it's hard to see how one would do that with some of what he thinks has to be done to understand sexual gender roles and its relation and subject formation. But also that he thinks that the attempt to treat children as like rational adults actually does psychic damage to them by denying and overexposing to them the sexuality at the same time. And that seems to be also part of what he thinks is going on in the cultural milieu. But again, in these chapters, he doesn't talk about this in terms of class at all. And that is actually very different from his other work. So that leads you to this kind of construction of the kind of therapeutic culture which he's trying to critique in liberalism. And I think it's interesting that he also tries to critique the quote party of the superego, which he says it doesn't cleanly relate to conservatives, like yes, Philip Reef, yes, Daniel Bell, but also Lionel Trilling, and those kind of 50s post-partisan review liberals. who didn't go full neoconservative, but definitely were close. He links them up with the party of the superego. But what is interesting is he doesn't give the party of the superego a particular history the way he does the liberal therapeutic ethos, where he goes through step by step what he thinks happens in the 20th century. There is none of that for the party of the superego. It's the party of the superego, and it doesn't work, but we have to admire it for trying. That's pretty much his approach to that whole trajectory. There's also the fact that he claims he's not describing a difference between right and left in the beginning of the chapter 6, but he pretty clearly actually is describing a difference between at least what he sees as the liberal therapeutic ethos and the superego ethos, which he at the end of the book slips up and says is basically a division between right and left. Although the emergence of the new left in its critique of managerial Fordism and these therapeutic modalities and behavioralist modalities seem to be what breaks that down. But he doesn't really talk about what emerges in its ashes. And in fact, if you read his later work, it seems like he basically gives up on of anything emerging in its ashes. So this makes Lasch a particularly interesting critic to deal with, particularly in the forms of psychoanalysis, because he's dealing with psychoanalysis, which was popular in America at the time, both in the more classical Freudian stuff, which he likes, in Chagall, Smorgasbord, Grunberger, Bettelheim, Kirchner, etc. Melanie Klein and Reich also get mentioned positively. But he's also really distancing himself from post-Frankfurt School neo-Freudianism. There's long attacks on Marcuse in this book. And there is actually in Culture of Narcissism too. He sees that the attempt to make the entire society fascistic in this post-Frankfurt School neo-Freudianism is a way to actually remove the left's responsibility to the working class entirely. But he also doesn't really deal with at all ever, except for a couple essays before a psychoanalytic period, actually existing socialist societies. He mentions them basically in his first book, but not in their own context in American liberals' response to it, specifically in the early 20th century response to the Russian Revolution. And they are mentioned again very briefly in The Agony of the American Left, but only as a model for outside appeal to Americans. And then again in The World of Nations, but again, only as an example of what revolutions don't do, and that the national revolutions don't fit the pattern predicted by the US left. And that's pretty much all he has to say on the matter. Which again makes it hard to figure out if he thinks this is a universal problem or an American problem. And how cleanly does he see the distinctions is not particularly clear. Now, I bring this up primarily, I've been a Lasch reader and now have become an ersatz Lasch scholar, which means I've had to go back and reconsider my stances on psychoanalysis, and we could talk about that if you want. But I've also had to go back and reread a whole lot of mid-century psychoanalytic writings, from Philip Rieff to Erik Erikson to Grunberger and Melanie Klein, to kind of grasp what was being appealed to here, because the contemporary left, as it exists, very much does seem to pull from the Marcusean strain. And like I've said, Lacan is a weird absence, right? I was looking in the index to make sure I didn't miss it. And yep, there is not a single mention of Lacan in this book. Nor is there a single mention of Lacan in this book. And I find that interesting, particularly when you look at his insistence that we have to deal with the Oedipal complex and not, say, the inferiority complex. One of his critiques of Adler is that Adler is too optimistic in dropping infant sexuality out of the picture. Now, one of the things about the Lacanian matrix, and I'm not an expert on Lacan, and we've already talked about my dislike of Lacanian verbiage often, but there is a sense in which Lacan deals with these gender apparatuses, but doesn't take them literally. They are seen in a more metaphorical psychic space. While in chapter 5, Lasch of the minimal self, Lasch does give space for these concepts to be non-literalized. He talks about female phalluses and whatnot, and how the Oedipal complex applies to both genders. More or less, he still takes Freudian infant sexual psychology as a factual given. And in fact, a whole lot of his explanations of the New Left are impossible if you don't. So for one of the things he's very upset with the New Left for in the minimal self is for abandoning both the ego idea and the superego, and not really embracing the id either. That they're not really even a party of the id. They're like a party of the rejection of self-constraints, and thus he sees them as an infantile extension of the wish for omnipotence in the womb, which he takes quite literally. And he explains most of the New Left's deviations from that point. I think that's interesting, but it strikes me as an attempt to use psychoanalysis to not make an argument, actually, to try to move what he sees as a descriptive problem with a normative solution into a descriptive solution as well. So it's an attempt in solving the problem to make them both descriptive. I'm not sure that works, and I'm not sure that someone like Lacan would not have kind of balked at that attempt. But nonetheless, that is what he's doing. And so that leads me to a kind of question, because there's also two things going on in his chapter on the liberal development of the therapeutic, when he goes through the behavioral, the humanistic, and the ego psychology branches, and ties them into modern liberal answers, particularly like center liberal answers. And it seems like when you read this portion of the book, and one of the responses I wanted to get from this group as you approach it is, in one hand, we can see the beginnings of the psychologicalization and the therapeuticization of politics in this. And if you don't know what I'm talking about, it's that like identitarian politics right now frames everything both as systemic, but also as interpersonal psychology at the same time. So in terms of microaggressions and triggers and trauma psychology and all of this. And we already see the beginnings of this trend in what he's discussing here. But the manifestations is completely different, because all the forms of psychology that he's really talking about have fallen out of favor in the US, and like have fallen out of favor to the point that they've almost been erased. So you can see the ego psychology has been kind of merged into kind of general post-psychoanalysis. Humanistic psychology has been slowly morphed into the more positive leaning stream of cognitive behavioral therapy, and also into positive psychology. Vomit. Sorry. And we can see that behavioralism has kind of given way to cognitivism. And this is actually with all kinds of stuff. My research on cybernetic theory also points out that cybernetics has behavioral mental assumptions run throughout it. In fact, it doesn't work if you don't have behavioralist assumptions for the most part. There are some people in Latin America actually who tried to fix that in the 1990s, but it never really caught on. And so we see all three trends kind of represented still, I think, today, but in ways that are totally unrecognizable from what Lasch is describing. And this brings me back to the politics of Fordism and neoliberalism, because I do think, and like again, Lasch doesn't state this explicitly in the chapter. You do kind of have to read two whole books and put them together and correlate them to get this. But that Lasch sees this form of psychology, these three forms of psychology, of psychoanalysis, of humanistic psychology, and of behavioral psychology, as all responses to management in a Fordist political economic system. Whereas later on, those things are going to die really quickly as they become unable to address a post-Fordist neoliberal economy. But it is strongly implied that the move from Fordism and secondary narcissism will move into neoliberalism and primary narcissism. But unfortunately for us, Lasch doesn't use those terms in his later writings. After these two books, he does not really use a psychoanalytic framework for the rest of his work. So The Revolt of the Elites is not really framed in psychoanalytic terms, and The True and Only Heaven has some psychoanalytic stuff in it, but most of it is a critique of equating technical and moral progress as the same thing. And a lot of what Lasch's answer there is a kind of revitalization of populism, a movement that, if you read most of his early writings, he thinks is failed. But he tries to revive it while admitting its failures in lieu of what he sees as, basically the psychic devastation of the end of Fordism. And now that I've given you guys the initial background, questions?
Man, thank you so much for this. Yeah, I have a bunch of questions. I just want to make sure if anyone else wants to go before. I know Daniel appeared, graced us with his presence after. He's like a Walter Benjamin of S2P, the fellow who joins every eclipse. So I'm not sure if he wants to jump in, but
Hopefully, it doesn't say Benjamin's fate. That would be very unfortunate.
That would be very unfortunate. There you go, Daniel. Please.
Hey guys, what's going on?
And by Benjamin's fate, he clearly means becoming like this hipster writer. That's like the thing you need to avoid.
Oh my God. Hi guys. So good to see everybody. Hi Fatima. It's been it's so nice to see everybody. My video is not working. Derick, that was an excellent talk. I have so many thoughts on this. I think Lasch's contribution to the left is only been recently recognized as, I think, relevant to reintroduce it. For many years, even you saw Zizek's review of the culture of narcissism, where he basically says that Lasch is kind of a neocon, So what does Lasch offer to the left, I think, is an interesting question. And I would say it's a sort of a kind of, I don't know how to put this, like a commitment to the undergirding visions of a libertine, emancipatory left. He did his PhD on Bolshevism. That's clear. He has these goals. He shares these goals with the left. So he can go into Marxist spaces, feminist spaces, and so on, but with a twist, right? And I think this is where the psychoanalytic thing comes in, because, this very famous, well, not famous actually, but not that famous, but at the time was very controversial. You had mentioned her before. She's this French psychoanalytic author. She wrote an anonymous book. Her name is Sheshegwe Smirgel. She's a psychoanalytic respondent to May 68. And her argument was that Wilhelm Reich and Reichianism is basically the pinnacle of 68. If there was a philosopher of 68, it would be Wilhelm Reich. Now, when Philip Reeve said the same thing, it just turns out I don't know if you knew this, Gabriel, or others, but Lacan spent several well, sometime during one of his seminars, responding specifically to her anonymous text, dismissing it completely. And everything had to do with her conception of frankly, of liberation, and this notion of the ego ideal and the emancipatory dimension involved with construing of liberation. This is sort of interesting. I'd like to see what Gabriel thinks as well as Derick. Construing of liberation, not from the standpoint of the abolition of repression. Both Philip Rieff, Schmergel, and Lasch argue that the left made a theoretical error regarding their use of psychoanalytic thought, and maybe even Marcuse did as well, which is it was overly libertine. Insofar as he even, I'll read this quote to you to give a sense. This really gives a nice sense of it if you just check this out. Schmergel's analysis of the ego ideal provides no support for the programs of sexual liberation and cultural revolution, which celebrate polymorphous perversity and a society without fathers. But neither does it uphold a normative schedule of psychological development in the manner of ego psychology, and nor does her vision idealize the radically separate autonomous ego as the end product of that development. An emphasis on the ego ideal as opposed to the ego itself allows us to see the development lies in the culmination of a loving union with the world that nevertheless acknowledges the fact of its own otherness. So you see already that Lasch is somebody that is sort of able to create an olive branch to, I wouldn't say the right, but it's both a sort of interesting inner critical commentary on the West's post-68 attempt to redefine revolution vis-a-vis cultural revolution. Now, how we make an assessment of the legacy of the new left today, I think, is another reason why Lasch has returned, right? It's precisely this intra-left, right? This kind of critique. And I think I'm writing a review on Schmergel's book. I recently wrote one on Rieff's book as well, The Triumph of Therapeutic. And I really think that he built, you know, I don't know if you agreed, Varn, but he built so much of his psychoanalytic perspective from their orientations. And so I guess the question is always for me one of a kind of ethical comportment. As Derick knows, there's some people on the left who feel that Lasch's critique is too strong against libertinism. The interesting thing I want to know from other leftists is to what extent do we feel that this kind of philosophy of restraint, of I don't know, because in Culture of Narcissism, Lasch is basically saying that, you know, late capitalism is producing this kind of stunting of our subjectivity, a kind of permanent adolescence, you know, this kind of I don't know, like, to me, that's the power of his analytic apparatus. The danger is the fact that when you start waging these critiques, you get a lot of pushback, especially for people. And it's not even really about identity politics. Identity politics is kind of a part of that. I would say it's more about how we conceive of the cultural revolution in some sense. So those are some thoughts. I don't know if you have any response to that, but thanks so much for your talk.
Yeah, I have a lot to respond, but I'm going to let the collective respond first because I've already pontificated for a bit. Does anyone else have anything to say before I respond to Daniel?
I have something to ask, but I'm not sure if it fits. I mean, I think it can contrast perhaps to what Daniel said. Just because, and since both you and Daniel know much more about Lasch, it's funny because I think for some of us here, Lasch became a relevant author through a reference that kind of a very important reference to him in a Brazilian philosopher's book. There's this Brazilian philosopher called Paulo Arantes who kind of indirect, like he makes a direct mention to Lasch, but doesn't commit to much of what Lasch is proposing. But he does mention the subtitle of Culture of Narcissism, the idea of an era of decreasing expectations as a kind of motive to propose a theory of why there is such a decreased expectation kind of background. But then there is a big distinction there, because for him, it actually concerns something that is almost like a Brodelian almost explanation, which is much more political economic and kind of a change of a world time, where it's just there is no reference to that. It's not really, there is no concern with psychology at all or psychic life in any sense. But there is this kind of reintroduction of Lasch into a discussion that comes from a different kind of route. And perhaps that's influencing what I'm going to ask here. But one impression that I have, that I think that you made it even clearer now, Derick, is that because the way that you mapped two things, right? That there is the party of the superego, it lacks a history. It's even the authors that he mentions, or the people who hold these views, are very scattered. They tend to be people who write almost from a critical literary kind of point of view. They mention superego as a kind of cultural artifact concept, right? Rather than a part of a therapeutic tradition with a practical application. Doesn't seem to be the core concern. It's like almost like a entry point to discuss morality from the moral struggle from a new point of view, or something like that. Then the other one, the liberal ego kind of centered position, is much more concerned with the therapeutic. It has a history that is institutional. So it can be kind of digged up as such. And then the third party is neither this nor that. It's also not a party of the id. So it's also, so at the same time that he seems to make use of these kind of Freudian topic, right, of id, superego, and so on, to divide these trends, he's actually tracking the real movement, like a real kind of division in a cultural, an intellectual milieu, rather than kind of, using the concepts as kind of for whatever it is that they actually mean. They're just marking like different groups. And it seems to me that the core idea is the existence of these trends in intellectual American life, more than if they really do refer back to anything really existing psychoanalytically. Why do I say this? Because it seems to me that there is a tendency, there is a threat of inverting cause and consequence here, cause and effect, where it's not that there are parties that are pushing politics based on these concepts, so much as there is something going on somewhere else that is distributing politics in such a way that they end up kind of coinciding with this superficially. So it's not exactly right-wing with the superego, but it's kind of, but it's also not exactly the superego because it's just a specific American reading of it. Then even the guys who reject all of this as not necessarily making the best use of psychoanalysis, like Marcuse and so on. So it seems on the one hand that he's very careful to stay on the ground of how these things are integrated into the intellectual discussion in the States, rather than just, let's say, assume that these are, actually politics of psychoanalysis, or like that are truly betting on these instances. And if they could come up with clinics to, stimulate one instance over the other, they would. And why do I say this? Because one thing that, and then this is the core of my what I wanted to hear you about, which I think is where I have a distinct position from Daniel. One thing that I take from reading Lasch is that I think he's probably one of the most aware intellectuals to realize that at the same time that you need to take some of these concerns with psychic structure, psychic life as being something that is affected by transformations in the, in larger political, socioeconomic structures, that transformations in Fordism are pressing onto the psyche in this way, that new demands are put on individuals to be able to account for certain things that they perhaps didn't have to account before, that the stage is set up in that way, it doesn't mean you should play the game inside of that stage, meaning the moment that you decide that this is actually a psychoanalytic discussion, that there's actually a psychological matter, you've perhaps accepted too much. Because part of the thing that needs to be explained is why are these large-scale mass structural problems being placed or recreated at such a small stage, at such a small scale? Like, it's already a mismatch in the background, right? Why would part of the pathology to be explained or to be properly understood is why are objective solidarity, mutual recognition, structures of mapping of class and class cohesion, why are they being substituted for something which is so restricted and bounded as one's psychic structure? Like, it's clearly too much to ask. So if you were to accept that that's the correct place to solve that issue, you would already have given too much, right?
Mm-hmm.
And I think that could be an explanation, besides the fact that Lacan perhaps wasn't really that relevant at that scene. If you start from the concrete way that people are divided in the intellectual scene, I'm not sure. But besides that, Lacan does accept with his theory because it's less equipped. It's almost like it's too powerful. It wants to explain that much. So it's not good if you have that kind of, underlying distrust that, sure, I need to talk about this. A lot of effects are appearing at the level of psychic demands, new ways that people structure their identities and so on. But if I take this privileged place as a starting point for discussing where to go, I will have given too much to the situation and lost something essential, So I'm not sure if this is coming from just my lack of reading and then it's missing something crucial, but it does seem that it puts the debate in two different terms. Like, should we just bring this other cool psychoanalyst into the discussion and that would give us a new position and whatever? Who cares what Lacan thought about these things? I'm not sure if he would be relevant to the problems of, corruption and destruction of basic class structure and class institutions or whatever, and what that affects with the working class. So I'm not sure if that would be the case, or if perhaps keeping away from people who have a global solution to this isn't the proper way of keeping the problem open, which is there is already a weird mismatch of accepting that that's more than a symptom. That's really where the game is going to be played from now on or something, I'm not sure if that makes total sense, but...
No, it makes sense. One of the things that I've been struggling with, particularly in this period of Lasch, is when I talk about the conflating the normative and descriptive. I often think leftists try to get out of making an argument about the bigger changes by shifting the terms of debate on descriptive of something else. And here I think it's a description of the psyche as played out in a larger social milieu. And I find it interesting that Lasch felt the need to do this because he could not explain all the implications of, frankly, one phrase, the personal is political, and its actual implications. What is interesting about Lasch's reception now, for example, because he was picked up by paleoconservatives largely after his death, like the Claremont Institute's always been interested in him. His biographer is some kind of Calvinist Christian. And if you look at people writing on Lasch between, say, 1995 and 2005, it's almost all paleoconservative, Roger Kimber style right-wingers. And I don't know if you guys deal with that motherfucker in Brazil, but basically just too reactionary for most of the American right, but not a racialist. That's what you got. Those were the only people interested in Lasch for a long time. And what was really interesting about that is Lasch explicitly rejected them over and over and over again. He also explicitly rejected neoconservatism. And by that, I mean, he was even offered positions at commentary and did not take them. But to answer your question about maybe it's the wrong way to address it, I think maybe Lasch thinks that too, because he drops it after these two books. Like, he doesn't try to continue to address the problem in these terms. In fact, he goes through two, we can kind of cultural economic turns, where he tries to return to Marxism in the mid-'80s, but he encounters a kind of Trotskyism that is blaming everything on the white working class, particularly the rise of Reaganism. And he rejects that as an extension of the kind of Frankfurt School, but going back now into classical Marxism. So it's no longer this just kind of academic, 68, post-critical theory Marxist doing this. He's now seeing it in like sectarian Trotskyist and Maoist. And then he tries to join the communitarians, but ultimately he finds them too conservative. He tries to go with Shlomo Averny and a bunch of former Marxists into the communitarian world, and he flirts with it very briefly and drops that as well. Then his last two books are basically an attempt to revive populism as an answer. But he's also damningly critiqued populism already and noted all of its flaws in his first 5 books. So it's very hard for him to do. He keeps on saying, well, we have to look at their virtues, but we have to acknowledge all their flaws. Here's a list of their flaws. Now we're going to ignore them and go back to what we thought was good about them. Part of the problem, and I think this is where the political economic stuff comes in, and why I mentioned that stuff about Baron and Sweezy, is he does not think that the political economic descriptions in classical Marxism hold after the 1950s. And so there is no way for him to conceive of a class abolitionist politics. Furthermore, he is ambivalent on the concept of revolution after the invention of the nuclear bomb. That's explicit in an essay in A World of Nations, where he says that, look, we can't make a revolution a metaphor for everything. I don't think it's obsolete, but we also have to admit that 19th century and early 20th century insurrections aren't happening in the cores of capital after the development of the state capacities that exist today. So part of why I think there's this juncture here, Gabriel, is I think he's actually despairing and trying to say, okay, if I accept that the personal is political, what are its implications? All right. But I don't think the reason why I don't think there's a solution in this book is because I don't think he thinks you can solve it on the train of psychic struggle, except by acknowledging that you have to admit that psychic struggle is real. Like, that's the only thing he says you have to do. Like, that you're not going to get rid of it, that there's going to be no removing psychic conflict. But other than that, he doesn't have an answer. It's definitely not a better psychoanalytic therapy. In fact, he increasingly mocks the idea of a therapeutic politics. It just comes up over and over and over again. And it's interesting because on one hand, he's critiquing lowered expectations, particularly lower social and economic expectations. On the other hand, he's also saying that leftists should accept ordinary unhappiness as part of what it means to be a leftist. So, I don't think we can just wave off that there's a tension there, right? And that you're picking up on it even in this small section of reading. And the larger view of his work, I don't think he answers the question. People have asked me, do I think Lasch died a conservative? And I don't think so, but I do think he died unable to answer the central problematic of his work, which was, how do you actually get out of this cul-de-sac that the American left, and by proxy, probably most of the Western left, is in? And he would also say he's only a cultural historian. He can't actually answer this with any other tools than the tools of his trade. Although you can already critique him for going beyond that by picking up psychoanalysis in the first place. But like I said, the way he writes about psychoanalysis, for the most part, with the exception of some endorsements of Smergel and Bettelheim and Kirchner and whatnot, is mostly as an intellectual history. And even then, he thinks that Freud has to be like expanded upon and critiqued. Like he talks about the inability of anyone in psychoanalysis to embrace the dual nature of the ego ideal, for example, but that's in another chapter. So I didn't have you read that, but it is, and he sees the ego ideal as maybe a way to begin to get out of this. But again, he's like, it's not, you can't simplify it as an easy way out of the problems. Like, the ego ideal itself has problems, and including ones that are repressive and even infantilizing. On the other hand, it's probably the only positive manifestation of the same tendencies that generate the superego. But you notice that he doesn't have like a party of the ego ideal. Like it doesn't exist. It's not his political typology here. Does that answer your question at all?
Sorry, I was muted. No, that helps a lot because, yeah, it helps on two fronts. I think helps on the front that, yes, I think that I wanted to understand this because I could see the mismatch between Lasch and a certain new left coming from that fact, the fact that, I mean, you cherish the guy for criticizing a kind of technocratic, therapeutic, or a superegoic kind of approach. But then when it comes to what you want to propose, which is, there is a lifting of repression, so he's not on your side. And then, well, that looks conservative compared to what I'm proposing, which is lifting this and that, or being liberatory in some sense. And the thing that I said, I think it's might be the turn of the screw that makes that subtlety interesting for today, is that there has been a new development, I think Daniel mentioned very well, which is you can double the bet from the new left by saying, no, but we actually agree with that critique because there is this other psychoanalyst, he also agreed with that. So you are allowed to keep with your kind of analytic politics, as if that's really the legitimate new site for this debate, by agreeing with some of his more subtle points about, well, this new left is also missing the point. So you can agree with that, but not agree with that underlying suspicion. And so I just wanted to understand a bit better. I think it's important what you said. It makes sense to me. And it makes it clearer that there is really an interesting mirroring between him and this Brazilian philosopher who was very, very relevant for stuff that we've done here. Because he's the minimal narrative, like in 4 lines, that his position is something like, we've seen, he was a Lukácsian pretty much. But then he says something like, well, transformations in structures of the dynamics of accumulation and so on have shown that there is kind of an increasing decoupling from the organization of work and the organization of workers, meaning you don't get one when you get the other. So a certain type of class experience is lost forever. That means that Lukács' move from class in itself to for itself is just truncated. It's not going to happen. What you get instead, it's the explosion of social conflict, which is never class conflict. It's just like punctual conflict and different theories of how you manage this punctual explosions, right? And a whole industry of the management of crises, so to speak, right? Which for him is nothing. Again, it's a stage that if you just accept that stage as where politics happens now, you miss something essential. So it looks like an interesting mirroring where on the one side, the explosion of psychic conflict and all the industry and technologies of managing that become something you need to look with. You need to admit that something changed, and the explosion of these things are a symptom of that. So you need to take that seriously, and there is a reality to this. It's not like a superficial effect for Lasch, and the same way that for him, the non-profits managing all sort of social malaise, all type of social conflicts emerging, but around specific demands that never gets an anti-systemic kind of feel for them. That's what exists. It's not to be dismissed, but it's also a kind of despair because there is no transitivity between that and the thing that was lost. It won't be recuperated by the correct approach to the new scenario. But for him, it's more still on the level of kind of more objective politics, where Lasch seems to focus a bit more. The terms of culture seem to point to this subjective dimension of politicization, right? But there seems to be a mirroring that the strategy seems similar to me now.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's interesting that just to emphasize that the earlier Lasch books, which are actually primarily thematically collected essays that are put forth usually in chronological time to actually kind of make an argument. that they don't have this concern with the psychic world at all. Like, they are mostly fairly objective histories of the left, and then questions about where that actually leads. There's a couple of exceptions to that where he talks about like the development of like bourgeois feminist life in specifically in the American frontier and isolated context through letters, where this psychological element comes back in. But there's a lot of even like Foucauldian, explicitly Foucauldian stuff in middle and early period Lasch, where he's talking about the development of institutions of control and critiquing them and tying them into Marxism. And he's also trying to do a lot of what I kind of take to be almost mythic typologies. This is one critique I have of Lasch. It's pretty big. When he talks about intellectuals and liberals, he's really good in his historiography. When he talks about the working class itself, he tends to focus on broad typologies with like no real clear definition of what working class is. So, for example, he talks about the working class culture of early Mormonism. By that, he means sharecroppers and early artisan laborers, which he seems to think as a proxy for the Marxist definition of working class, right? But it's, if you really read Marx deeply, it's not. And this sort of problem comes up a lot in his other work. It doesn't come up in this one. And like I said, it's because the class dimension seems to be weirdly absent here, except for the talk about the development of managers and technicians. So one of the interesting things about Lasch, this is additional conception to think about here, is initially he rejects the concept of the PMC. When Barbara and John Ehrenreich develop it in the late 60s, he thinks it's too broad. It doesn't deal it like in one sense it's not materially grounded enough. In another sense, it lumps too many things together. But by the end of this book, he starts talking about the professionals and management as distinct classes. And that seems to be part of his concern, which I find kind of interesting. And I don't know what Daniel's take of this. My theory on people who get obsessed with the quote PMC is that they're frustrated with the lack of Marxist subjectivity, but they're also usually of the class they're complaining about, if you even consider it a class. They're definitely of the strata they're complaining about, no matter how you define it. And so I ironically often think it's like a sign of narcissism to overfocus on that. But there is something real going on. And I think in the context of Fordism, you definitely see these predominance of managers. And specifically, the managers in like James Burnham, who I know Lasch was very familiar with, for example, were not the PMC as we think about it post Ehrenreich. They were literal, like they were shareholders, they were stock holding company managers, bank managers, things like that, and they were the military trained management. For non-Americans, the professional managerial class, sorry. Which is an obsession in America after the Bernie loss. We just haven't shut the fuck up about it since Bernie Sanders lost the second time, even though the theory's been around since 1968. Yes, Daniel.
Couple of things. I mean, I think for folks that are kind of maybe less familiar with this paradigm of Laschian studies, I mean, it's a bit of a kind of Max Weberian approach to understanding society and culture, as well as very much a Frankfurt School orientation, right? And I think that's important. So when Gabriel was mentioning this argument, that I mean, I think for Lasch, there is something, I think, to be said for a homogeneous public sphere in which intellectuals have a certain transitive relationship to the coherence. So it's a very kind of like rationalist take, if you think about like a theory of power, which actually, when Lacan responds to this text I mentioned earlier, one of the things that he says is actually this precise point, which is that basically it's un-Freudian because it tries to derive a theory of the discontents of civilization from a culturalist point of view, and it's always shifting. This is part of the reason why Lacan, of course, develops his theories of the discourses, which is a completely different way of thinking about this historical link of social causality and so on. So I think it's important that folks understand that. And I think there's also further an argument to be made, perhaps, that the disillusion of the public sphere in neoliberalism might also mean that the Laschian framework of cultural theory becomes more problematic to get off the ground. And you see this a lot in queer theory when they talk about it's not so much that there's a homogeneous public sphere where culture is produced, but there's the rise of counter publics, for example, and a fragmentation of the public sphere. So I wonder, Derick, if you think that Lasch has an account of the fragmenting public sphere, because in a sense, that seems to me possibly a vulnerability of Lasch's approach. You see this all over Minimal Self and a lot of his work, which is, and even going back to his study of intellectuals, for Lasch, and this is something I love about him, and also he gets it from Philip Rieff, a movement, a social movement, is instantiated in the thought of a major philosopher. Now, I know that Gabriel hates this idea for various I don't know, historical, he thinks it's a flawed method of doing history. Okay. Like, for example, May 68 is Reichian. For Tupanamba, he would say, what the fuck does that even mean? Like, what do you mean? But I think that actually is a somewhat defensible position to maintain. Like, that actually is an interesting position to maintain. And I think that has merits. But perhaps one of its biggest downsides is this question of the fragmentation of the public sphere. I wanted to throw that out there. Also because one of the things that has occurred after 2008 is that liberalism and the liberal elite have experienced significant, this is the PMC piece, significant vacuum of their own power, of their own efficacy within the public sphere. Now that actually is a blessing for the left if we know how to seize it. If the ruling class is in disarray, I mean, look at all of the billionaires. None of their candidates win in elections. Like, there's this kind of weird latent class war going on, and the liberal intelligentsia has no trust from the people in ways which are unprecedented historically, in some sense, perhaps. So thoughts on that, on Lasch? I guess maybe I'm inviting folks to reflect on Lasch's methodology of cultural theory, of kind of reading cultural events vis-a-vis like Rieff does, an age can be Freudian. Like the ushering in of the therapeutic, Freud is the prophet of this age. The prior prophet of the last age was Nietzsche in Rieff's vision. Mm-hmm. So it may sound kind of strange, but just want to make clear that this is the model by which Lasch, I think, is working.
So to point out a few paradoxes in this, because I don't want to disagree with you, but I do want to complicate it. Like, one of the footnotes in chapter 6 of Minimal Self is him actually mocking Weber's rationalistic discourse, like, explicitly, even though he actually accepts Weberian terms of class. I actually think if you read Weber's theories of class more than, say, Marx's, a lot of Lasch's stuff makes perfect sense because it's about like social capture and access. And that's why he considers intellectuals, for example, their own class. He doesn't even consider them part of PMC. They're their own weird thing for Lasch. And that's been true going all the way back to his early work. That's not a late development. He also does see, and he particularly writes about this in terms of education, of the closing off of the commons, because he talks about education increasingly from the 1950s forward becoming commodified and a commodity in and of itself, and thus closing off the general intellect. So something that Marx doesn't even think is possible, right? Like that's one of the things he's writing about. That said, he doesn't seem to, in general, extend that to the culture as a whole. He flirts with that in Revolt of the Elites, but for those of you who don't know, and I'll give you a little bit of Lashian studies on that, Revolt of the Elites is an unfinished book that he wrote when he was dying of cancer, right? So he did not feel when he died that it was ready for publication. He felt like it was too raw of a screed, basically, even though it does seem to have been his. I used to think maybe it was his daughter's, but having read more on his daughter, no, I think it was his, but he did not refine, this like primal scream of anger at the cultural elites in the United States and their seemingly abandonment of any libertarian project. He sees it, this trend from the late 60s to the middle 80s, basically, as this great betrayal of these people to form a more liberatory counter elite or whatever. I mean, this is basically what he says. They give in to narcissism and then they foreclose everything. And this is where the like Steve Bannon, Christopher Lasch comes from, right? Is this kind of scream at the end. But I do think the tensions that you are pointing out, Daniel, are both real, but Lasch actually is vaguely aware of them. Like he does seem to think, for example, when he writes about neoliberalism, that it has fundamentally changed something about the public, which is why he becomes weirdly obsessed with pre-industrial bourgeois culture. Like if you read his last book, he's constantly writing about artisans and stuff as like, a way to impart a kind of semi-proletarian morality that has a more positive vision than the deracinated proletarian that he thinks exists in the 1980s. Now,
right. That's a very great point.
Yeah, what I would think is a pretty big critique of this is, again, this is weirdly an American-centric book. Like all of his books are weirdly American-centric. Like it seems to be like even the 60s kind of, yes, we're talking about European intellectuals. Yes, we have to talk about May 1968 in France, but really, it's really about us here in America. We don't really deal with any of the other stuff. And it's this disconnection that I think is that I would say is another weakness of Lasch, that he doesn't really put the American context in a world context, which I think would necessarily be more political economic. Now, I can't blame him for that. I mean, fuck, I think no one does that these days, but it is a problem. So I think we have those various contentions. I also think if you want to critique Lasch on another kind of quasi-conservative point, there does seem to be a kind of Durkheimian social functioning going on here somewhere. Like he kind of thinks that like this is what maybe where the flirting yeah, it does make life easier to ignore the rest of the world. This is where the flirting with like communitarianism may come from, is like a community would be a self-regulating function if we can only get back to that. Lasch doesn't seem to think we can get back to that, to be fair. Like he admits this, but he also constantly seems to want to, particularly in his 1980s writings. The one that might interest you guys, and I don't know how the internet has exposed you to the depravities of American leftism. Hopefully not too much, because it's bad for you. But one of the developments recently is the third wave of post-leftism. Now, they don't call it the third wave, but we've had two prior waves of post-leftism. One is, I think, neoconservatism itself. Two was this weird wave of anarchism in the 1990s that got very strange, and Ted Kaczynski worshiping, and they called themselves post-leftists. And then recently, we've had these kind of class collaborationist people who argue that Marx is against the left, that the left has always, been something that Marx is critiquing, that it's the left wing of capital. And it's a weird mixture of like, from like the classical Marxist spectrum of the ultra left and the right deviationist at the same time. So you'll get like calls to strengthen the police mixed with like, we can't deal with the left of capital mixed with people will be citing like like a Daniel Bell and also Amigo Bordiga at the same time. It's bizarre. But it's a real tendency in America, and it kind of cultivated in this turn of a lot of Marxists who became very sympathetic to the national conservative movement. Now, I don't really think they're a threat of any political size. Honestly, they're well funded and still don't seem to be able to do anything. But one of the things that you will see is they really pick up on the Lasch of this last period, but they do ignore some of his pushbacks on some of this stuff. For example, they'll pick up on his critique of the left and which comes out, it's very clearly stated in a kind of maddening essay that he wrote for Tikkun magazine in 1987. And they often quote this because this is like, he writes this long essay that starts off as a critique of the right's claim to be a working class party, which is funny, right? The Reagan right was pulling this, which, by the way, if you listen to current rhetoric now, they're saying this again, that like, oh no, we're the real party of the working class, etc., which is always countered with like, well, there is no working class politics. It's only like racial politics, and working class politics is always a proxy for white politics, both of which are false. But this is a common American narrative that we've seen since the 1970s, really. And it's come back. And so a lot of these post-leftists want to have their cake and eat it too, and adopt the politics of this kind of right-wing cultural movement, critique the blue heroes or whatever, for their decadence, and also be quote, the real Marxists. Some of them do this by being Marxo-purist or anti-left Marxist. Some of them become weird internet cults, like the MAGA communist, which have tons of followers, but yet no one actually really deals with them in real life. I mean, I have met a few in the actual world, but they don't organize. They're not in parties. They don't even really seem to have that much political efficacy outside of a few things around the anti-war protests in America, that have taken this even further and adopted like a hyper-conservative social ethos, like praising Stalin for criminalizing homosexuality and stuff like that, talking about how we need to appeal to the social ethos of the most right-wing elements of Trumpism, while also claiming to be more Marxist than now. Now, this doesn't necessarily seem to directly relate to Lasch, but Lasch does seem to be a gateway drug for a lot of these people. Like, what I find interesting about that is that if you read Lasch carefully, he criticizes this pretty strongly in his book. I mean, even when he talks about like the party of the superego, which he sees as flawed, he also talks about, well, there's also just the party of absolute repression, and that's a different thing. He doesn't really go into what it is. He talks about like the right that just wants to use force, and he says the superego is different from that. But again, he doesn't like that's mentioned offhandedly, right? So yeah. Do you guys have anything? Actually, this is an interesting question. Is there anything like post-leftism in Latin America, like in Brazil or in anywhere in South America? Because we can't tell. It does seem to have some pull in Germany and in England, but we really don't know in America if it's really spread out anywhere else.
Not sure if anyone wants to take on that question, but yeah, I mean, from my perspective, I think that it does exist insofar as we imitate a lot of the stuff online that we see coming from from the trendsetters, and then of course we have our own little debates, but they're very superficial. I wouldn't say it reflects very much on the kind of party politics or social movements, autonomists in Brazil. It's hard but there is a different way, I think, that tension appears, which I think it's very interesting, because we actually had a good example of of, I would say, a healthier version of this, much healthier version. In our group, we had a friend over called Crisanto. He's part of a popular housing movement in Brazil, but he was part of a leftist party, which could be associated with the DSA in its kind of general socialist thing, but it's actually a small group. It has a bunch of tendencies inside of it. Some are more radical, some are less radical. And their position 10 years ago of this particular housing movement was that they were the right wing inside the left wing. But what that meant wasn't entering into debates about moral values or things like this. Their general approach was, it's actually weirdly connected to a kind of Maoist thing that they did, which is, look, we organize the housing movement in peasant areas or kind of peripheral areas of urban places. You need to be ready to speak the language of these places. They won't meet your criteria of certain values or even leftist values. But at that point, you need to choose between, do you speak your own language? Do you do what needs to be done? And that's a choice. That's a political choice. And they used to play with that idea that they were the right wing inside the left wing because they would opt to continue constructing things with those people in religious terms. They used to translate every action they did in terms of, biblical passages. And, it was not condescending. It was very, very interesting. I actually recommend the video of his presentation a lot. But it was coded as a response to a dilemma, which I think you mentioned, and I think it's something that also reverberates a bit with a certain reading of Lasch we have in Brazil, which is this idea that at some point there is a strange culturalization of politics. It's not a politics of culture, it's the inverse, meaning your leftist position is the very thing that removes you, or it's meant to operate something at the social distinctive level. And I think that this gets totally entangled with this discussion of the PMC, because it's just hard to accept that you can create that contradiction. I think that something that makes sense at the level of class doesn't make sense at the level of community, and those things don't match. Which leads me to the other comment I wanted to make, which I have the impression that, it seems highly complicated, and I can't reverse engineer from the stuff I read by Lasch, how he structures the basic machinery or the architecture of these categories, like family, community, identity, public space, where these things interact with the socioeconomic. Like, for me, this is a bit confusing where he stands on some of these things and how they interpenetrate and where he sees divisions. But on the more, let's say, interventionist side of his work, he seems more aware than others that we counted on a kind of overlap between, let's say, class community and class structure meant these things decouple at some point. All sorts of weird pathologies emerge. Some of them have this weird paradoxical effect where your very intellectually kind of pro-working class position is the very thing that will function to distinguish you from there, because these things just become highly complicated. And my impression is that a lot of this big mess that I really can't follow. I don't like Twitter and social networks to begin with. I don't understand them. Other people here are more well-versed in them. But when I opened and I see like the American left debating and the amount of like small differences that have absolutely no bearing on reality, and this thing that we've been calling in the STP the idea of an endogenous reproduction of the left, which is the idea that once your categories are so saturated that you can't measure their efficacy against any real movement, the last feedback structure you have to control, regulate what you're doing is other sectors of the left. And this creates a double movement, which is you need to regulate yourself by the errors of everyone else. So from a part of the left, you're constantly regulating with whatever other parts of the left are saying. So you spend a lot of time with this. And on the whole, the aggregate effect is that you're telling everyone who is not on the left that everyone is in error, because at some point, everyone will point the finger to someone else. So you get this double movement, which is very endogenous looking. It does look to me that it's in itself a good example of this kind of how hard it is to come to terms with that decoupling, that there is something of class structure and class and communitarian experience and all the terms that come along with this, because then you are lost between, psychic structure as the minimal unit. Then you start discussing family, you start discussing community and identity, then community, then discourse, then language. All these terms, they become like this. Each one chooses a candidate for the thing that will merge back the two things, if you just find the right place. So it just sounds like a big mess to me. And I'd say that in Brazil, because the left has more traction and there are things that still keep some level of, external reference, reality testing to things. Mm-hmm. I mean, we do have like really big social movements, which are definitely on the socialist spectrum in a way that I don't think there's nothing similar happening in the States or things like that. It does give it a bit more of grounding and produces things like what I meant, which is I feel like it's a more productive treatment of that, recognizes that there is some weird tension, for example, by saying, if you want to speak of, if you want to engage with actual construction of a housing movement in the periphery of in a city in Brazil, you're going to have to deal with very weird, and conservative positions, and you need to lean on something which is not your individual values to continue. So that does create that sort of tension between the right and left-wing values and left-wing efficacy, which I think is often the basis for the, pointing fingers to ultra-leftists and saying that they're hypocritical, or pointing fingers to like liberal leftists and saying that they lost touch with the reality of the working class or whatever. I mean, that the same thing that makes this spin in the void, I think, can be reality tested in certain places here, I think. And just to give a question back to you based on this, is we had a really nice couple of conversations for a couple of months actually with the Communist Caucus around their text on political disorganization and the proletarian disorganization as a kind of key concept for them. I wonder if you follow their political stuff at all, what you think of it. And I mean, it does seem like it's again an attempt to revamp this discussion of something has been decoupled. You need to find something to latch onto in reality in order to evaluate your politics, which is not, your own sense of leftism as a community, but it sounds a bit different to me from some other position. So I wonder if that has been relevant at all.
Yeah. So one of the unfortunate things about my life and in the left-wing spaces, I keep up with these American left tendencies, and I have for a long time actually noticed what you're talking about, which is they're endogenously self-critiquing, that they are removed from any class reference, and they will make class references up to have one when there isn't one. Like, my favorite one is part of like the constant expansion and contraction of what PMC, professional managerial class, means, which is literally everyone who's ever stepped foot to a college to elites who actually run banking institutions. Depends on who you're talking to, and the same person will use both definitions in the same conversation, the way like Protestants will talk about God, as like their definitions will move around and they're not even realizing they're doing it. So I definitely see that. When it comes to the Communist Caucus, on one hand, their focus on class autonomy and their hesitance to focus on the other political parts of the American left, I think, are wise. I can't join the Communist Caucus because I'm a podcaster. They don't let us in. Probably not. It's probably, however, somewhat self-defeating, because their ability to actually build capacities outside of areas where they're already highly concentrated and are already relatively well off to the rest of the United States means that they're dealing with a mixture of some of the worst social conditions in the US, but also under some of the best social conditions in the US, which is why they're kind of like pretty much only in specific areas of Southern California. I, however, think they are speaking to a real problem, which is the inability to actually have a working class politics that doesn't use a cultural turn as a stand-in for the working class, which is what you see. And you see it, and I'll call out names here. You see it from Midwestern Marx to certain, people around Compact, to even some of the normal Jacobin DSAers who get all uppity about the blue hairs. I mean, if you look at, for example, Jacobin's definition of working class, it's not a Marxist political economic definition. They use the same definition as liberal pundits, and it's mostly cultural, or it's tied to income quotients, and that's it. All right. So that tendency is kind of across the board in the US right now. And the Communist Caucus is an interesting answer to that. I think they're so afraid, though, of the corrupting influence of, say, the left media space or whatever. They're limiting their ability to get out of very specific areas of the country. And I don't know. I've often thought about this as part of the problem of organizing in the US as opposed to organizing in other places is geographic. Like the sheer scale of what you have to deal with is hard to fathom because you have multiple urban areas with very different industries that have very different concerns and standards of living. And most of the left is concentrated in about 4 of them. And they're mostly coastal. And so what's interesting about CC, to get into the dynamics of the DSA for a minute, and then I'll tie it back into Lash, I promise, is that the CC is one of the only left-wing movements in the DSA as a caucus, as an organizational tactic, whatever, that is in a major urban area. What is interesting about the various caucuses in the EU and in the DSA, even though the left caucuses, because of the CC's help, actually, was able to really overperform in the last, political board, the NPC, the National Political Committee, which really is important because the DSA overcommits to too many things in its funding. And thus, to adjudicate between that, the MPC has to go in and actually decide where the funding really goes for the convention. And they have most of the power in the organization. The right wing of the DSA, which are the people from Jacobin rightward, to the old Harringtonites, et cetera, have been dominating that since forever. They actually come out of the large cities. I mean, they have their own caucus in New York going back into the 1980s, even though, the DSA was tiny back then. The more radical tendencies in the DSA tend to come from small areas where the left doesn't have access to normal conventional electoral power. The Communist Caucus really is the exception to that. Even the Marxist Unity Group, if you look at where a lot of their people are located, it's like Florida or like upstate New England or upstate New York. It's not in the centers of conventional DSA power. That's interesting, but it is still kind of decoupled from, actual working class politics in a lot of ways. Like, even when there's been forays into unionism, the Communist Caucus is the only people really trying to work with the unions who is not primarily working with union leadership. And by that, I don't mean elected union leadership. I mean professional union leadership, which come out of like schools of management. So there's been that shift. One of the things I think Lasch was really worried about, to tie this back in, and I think we see this in this endogenous replication of the left, is that he thought that the left was primarily coming from students and professors who've been removed from the predominant class dynamics of American society. And I think in the 1970s and 80s, he was actually pretty much right about that. That's not true anymore, but those habits and who exhibits them are still throughout the U.S. greater working class, because we push more and more people into credentialization over the past 40 years. Like to get a fucking fast food management job, you often have to have a goddamn degree. So like, while that's changing right now, just from a labor shortage, that credentialization trend is finally being reversed. That's been the trend of the past generation and a half, which means the intellectual culture of the left has spilled out into the larger world. Now, there was some hope by people like Barbara Ehrenreich, who kind of picked up on this Laschian thesis, that this would lead to these intellectuals being proletarianized and siding with the left. And I think to some degree, Barbara Ehrenreich was right, but there seems to be a limit to it. And this limit seems to be like a fear of true proletarianization, right? And what I find interesting in Lasch is that's never considered. Lasch does not think that the political economic realities could push a lot of these people back into the actual working class. He thinks that they're removed from them. Like, you know, once you get into these professional and managerial cohorts and the intellectual cohorts, that you are effectively de classe A, or that you have petit bourgeois interest, in the bad sense, not in, like, he actually likes artists and petit bourgeois interests. That's a different thing. And that you are pretty much out of the game for him, which is why he started encouraging populism, because he thought, oh, the working class could step back in, they can get some of these skills from these people who are being pushed downward, but we're not going to pretend they have the same politics, because they don't. And I think that is a real limitation. But it's interesting when you talk about this. Like, I was thinking about your talk about this whole Maoism thing, right? When we talk about like appeals to like rural poverty and whatnot, there's been two tendencies Maoists have tended to do historically in Latin America. The shining pathway, which is to go and start all the fights with the elders, end up getting your female cadres killed, retaliating against that, and starting a civil war with local indigenous people, are this kind of very concessionary way. And what it's interesting about that is those are both totally rooted in Mao. Like, all right, both those approaches are really already in Mao himself. You can find plenty of documentation for them. You know, before I got into explaining Christopher Lasch to leftists, which, you know, I've been reading Christopher Lasch for a long time. I used to actually be more of a scholar of Chinese communism. So like, it's something that I actually care about. What I find interesting is what the Cultural Revolution represents in America versus what it represents in the developing world. And I don't say, I'm not like a third worldist or any of that. You know, I know the history too well to fall for that shit. But there is something interesting about the distinction there. Because what does that Cultural Revolution represent in the United States versus what it represents in a place with, let's say, more non-capitalist elements of society, like where there's still an actual fucking peasantry, for example. This means that has a very different tenure. So, for example, the move for rustification in the context of, say, China, or even in a place like, I don't know, Brazil, is not a Pol Pot move to kill the intellectuals. It's actually a move to take the concentration of intellectual capital in the cities and disperse it amongst the population, particularly in the countryside, to help them catch up. That's what it was for. It wasn't just to punish the intellectuals. Now, it had the side effect of doing that and removing opposing cadres from you. So there's all of that reason Mao may do it. But its justification was actually kind of the beginnings of the breakdown of town and city, and the concentration of knowledge, right? And frankly, it kind of worked, all right? However, in, say, somewhere like the US, that can't possibly be what that represents, because there's no peasantry and there's no real cartel. Like, there's a commodification of knowledge, but there's not a high concentration of it. Like you can find specialists anywhere if you really want to. And communication systems are developed enough that you don't have to physically move people to get this to happen, right? So in the United States, that same move takes on a totally antinomian character. It's just against established authority, and I think that's also true in France, which is why, interestingly, like Maoism does not have the same valence in the developing world for material economic reasons, which is something that I think is often missed when we discuss this and we discuss cultural revolution, because it means something very different in the context of China coming out of an incomplete and an highly imperialized bourgeois development than in the context of the United States, which, it's funny, I was reading people trying to compare us to China. I'm like, so we should do the Chinese style. And I was like, what? We've already developed all of our productive capacity. What the fuck are you talking about? Like, why do we need to do that? So in that sense, I think that representation really breaks things down. What I think Lasch misses, though, is where this stuff came from in the first place. Why it would have ever came to America, why people would have been attracted to it, because of its seeming efficacy in the developing world, because neither he nor the people who are picking this up are really thinking about the difference of conditions in any serious way. Ooh, okay, rant over.
I'm trying to read everything Daniel wrote here. Yeah, I think I'm not sure if Daniel wants to say something.
No. This is great. I mean,
you're just cheering along. Okay.
No. I mean, I just wanted to say briefly, I really appreciate what Derick's response to Gabriel's questions. I thought that those are some excellent points on the Communist Caucus. The question of the kind of, maybe you could say, the shortcomings of Lasch's, of the period of time in which a certain theory of intellectuals in power was reliant on this presupposition that you have something like the transitive possibility of some kind of ism, whatever it may be, to sort of catch on and sort of have efficacy within a class project, and that then trickles down into the cultural signifiers that the people adopt, and that has some reverberations and ripple effects into the culture writ large. I think it's precisely that transitive relation, I hope you understand what I mean by that, that seems to me to have broken down, right? In the sense of the kind of, and you know, again, you know, it's an issue of the Bourdieuist thesis, really, because Bourdieu diagnoses this as a kind of overwrought credentialing crisis, right? So it creates a kind of strain of the bourgeois class itself. And it ultimately means that their project itself is not coherent to themselves, nor does it have this transitive possibility to affect the culture in some ways. So I almost wonder if Revolt of the Elites was Lasch's commentary about the collapse of this, of the relationship between the way that these antinomian ideas were incorporated into from the far left, because much of what Lasch talks about, you know, is how far left ideas hit the mainstream and how they then shape the mainstream in some ways. And I think that he makes a lot of great points in that regard. Of course, it's no surprise that post-left is going to say that apropos wokeism, which I think is, most of that is highly shallow. I don't think that, you know, but nonetheless, one can see that if Lasch were alive today, he probably would be writing a book about the woke situation. I wish he was alive, because he would be right. He would be pointing things out that most commentators don't capture, right, adequately in this whole dynamic. But that too is an example of this theory. Now, I would wonder what Gabriel thinks about the kind of methodology of this cultural form of critique. of sort of thinking about how ideas affect social arrangements of class and power. I'm curious, actually, if you have thoughts on that, because I know that we've debated it over the years, Gabriel, and I know that you are sympathetic to much of Lasch. I'm even thinking here Byung-Chul Han. Byung-Chul Han in the Burnout Society and all of his works kind of does something similar, where he's giving, although he's using Foucault, right? He's giving a cultural analysis, right, of a kind of, here is the sort of new way that power is working today, right? So yeah, I guess I wanted to open it up and talk maybe a little bit more about the methodology itself. And I'm wanting people that are maybe critical of it to weigh in on that. Or maybe people are less critical of it than I'm thinking.
You just made me uncomfortable by comparing Lasch to Byung-Chul Han, because
I didn't mean to, but there's a similarity of approaches, only insofar as when I read their works, I do walk away with the clarity regarding the process by which culture subjugates, and develops a certain form of subjectivity, certain tendencies, or I don't know.
Yeah, to talk about Byung-Chul Han, and I'll definitely leave it up to people to respond. I've read a lot of Byung-Chul Han, and initially I'm always impressed, and then I read it closely and then I get mad. Because I feel like there's all these hints of an intellectual genealogy and hints of an actual intellectual history, but then you actually dig into it and you're like, you didn't give me enough, man. I don't actually know I don't actually know that I can justify that theory there. And also, just saying neoliberalism over and over again doesn't actually do shit. So like, I don't even know what you mean. So it was funny because when I first read Byung-Chul Han, I thought, like, I really was like, oh, this is really cool. Then I was like, wait, am I being bamboozled here? I think I'm being bamboozled here. And I say this as a person who's like studied a lot of the same things that Byung-Chul Han is interested in. Like I've hung out in Buddhist monasteries in Korea. It's something that I've done. So yeah, I'm tough with most of your boys, Daniel. Anyway, Raphael, what's up?
Rafa, do you want to say something terrible about
Raphael?
I had the same impression. It was like the first few pages, man, he's onto something, and then you just pay attention to it. And then this just looks like theory. This isn't theory. He's not doing really anything. He's conjuring like books. He got books. He read them, of course, and that's all. He's a book reader. Sorry, Daniel, but I mean, I think at least it's a majority opinion over here, right?
Yeah,
I have my problems with Han. I was simply pointing out that there's a sort of similarity. If you read Lasch's works of cultural theory, psychoanalytic cultural theory, he's deriving, he's reducing large-scale aggregate tendencies of psychic power arrangements, right? It's exactly what Byung-Chul Han is doing. Of course, Lasch is more rigorous because he's trained as a historian, and his references are more coherent as well as historical materialist, if you like, that I think than Han is by far. So I mean, I'm with you guys. I'm just simply saying some of the things you walk away with, Lasch should be more convincing. Just simply saying that there was that particular method that I wanted to raise and just question.
Well, I think that the paradigmatic example of that would be what Psychopolitics by Byung-Chul Han, right? Where like you have these cultural almost vignettes that seem like true enough, and are used emblematically of large scale movements. Funnily, I associate that with theory, and I associate that with like punditry. in the bad sense. Like there's a way in which that also reminds me of someone like Tom Friedman, which is probably the most insulting thing I could say about Bang Johan. But it's what it reminds me of. One of the things that I think this convinces me of is if we do theory, we should never train in theory. We should always train in something else. Like, you know, like theory should be what we come to as an after effect, not as what we actually studied. But and I say this as a person who studied what did I study, like fucking anthropology and English, you know, like. But nonetheless, I think that's the case. I do think it's interesting. I mean, the gaping hole for me and Lash is that there's vague whiffs of political economy and there's broad movements of political economy that are kind of hinted at and understood in, I think, a profound way. Like the effects of that political economy on culture is actually stated in a way that it isn't in a lot of other places. But he doesn't flesh it out. I think part of that's his training, but I also think like you would need to do a lot more actual economic analysis to get to these points in a way that would be rigorous. And I think that would move you away from, you know, anything beyond like, yes, we have to acknowledge that psychic struggle is real, you know, and you know, great point. I agree, you know, like, but I don't know, like, I don't know what politics actually comes from that. And I don't think Lash does either, frankly. And that's been a big point because one of the things that I use is both an acknowledgement of the power of Lash, but also a critique of him. I've liked him in every phase of my political life, including when I was a reactionary. Like, so just to like think about that for a minute. Like I still like him and I still think there's profound insights there, but the fact that I could like him in all phases of that journey, including when I was just barely not a fascist, is a little concerning, right? There's something that even if Lash expresses it in close reading, you can totally miss. So yeah, if for those who don't know, I used to be a right winger, like a very right winger. So yeah.
Can I just go back to a point? I mean, though I think that at some point in our lives that's a necessity, at least when, you know, at least between the ages of 0 and that will happen. Just two things that I wanted to get back to because I think they're pretty relevant to this discussion. And I think now I understand Daniel's point a bit better because I think that's first of all a way to, let's say, separate Lash from these other types of kind of, you know, I'm not sure we need a name for this genre of sociology, which is like the new thing that is wrong with the world, and you choose one thing. We're all tired. We're all wired. We don't have families. We have too much family. You choose one thing and you track it, and that's like a diagnostic sociology or something. The one thing that I think is already different is that if the trend of interpretation we were pursuing before makes sense, it would make sense that Lash is at least more aware that the very need to settle certain accounts at those levels of discussion of what's wrong with people today, you know, like individuals and technology, individuals and they're tired because of whatever. There's already a weird, I would put it in these terms, I don't think it has anything to do with how he approaches it, but it's just this downscaling towards a smaller stage, which is, you know, something that experience still holds the key to some fundamental structure. So you're pressed down. So for example, you produce new types of psychic suffering, psychic different subjective pathologies and so on. Sure, you can track that, but then there is the part of the pathology is the expectation that little symptom still holds a transitive key to the whole, right? I think that he's aware of this, as per the things we were discussing. Okay, psychoanalysis is relevant, but let's, not put all the cards there. It's the same type of argument that would keep him from, saying psychic struggle is real is adding a new parameter for concrete analysis. It's not telling you what the setting is of that parameter. That's kind of irrelevant. Like, there is no different politics you're going to make because you read one of these diagnostic sociological books. Like, they don't make political decisions relevant. They just explain why you can't do things usually, which is, you can have 10,000 of fancy theories for that. So I have the impression that's the first point that's interesting, which is there's something about him. And I think that, conservative or not, at some point there a certain type of critical or just thinking people for whom they're just sharp enough that doesn't really matter. But there's a type of awareness of certain easy solutions that creates these desperate writers with a lot of clarity of certain things. And I do feel like he falls more on that side than most of this diagnostic sociology, that there are good people like Eva Illouz discussing intimacy in modernity, but 90% of German sociology is all about the problem with modernity is acceleration. The problem with modernity is lack of intimacy. And you choose one thing. And I think that guy, I don't know how to pronounce his name, that he falls in this tradition in a way, which is, I think, I wouldn't put Lasch in that tradition because of that awareness that something happened that you would even imagine that this type of intellectual pursuit is relevant to those questions. Why didn't we do this before? It was kind of irrelevant because that's not the side of a decision. So why did it become a side of a political decision? That's already part of the problem. So that's the first part. I think it's kudos to him versus some other people. But then you said something, Derick, you need to come back and tell us more about Chinese politics, please. But that I think it's very interesting. And to me, it's really a crucial thing. I know a lot of people here at our group have been working on this from a different angle, but the lack of proper account of distinct social formations and distinct, for example, this basic fact that Cultural Revolution in China means something totally different than it could ever mean in the States and in Latin America in a certain sense. We also try to make our, the Chinese Latin connection, and that also turned really weird. We have today interesting Christian Maoists, for example. I'm not sure Mao would like that very much, but
Dung probably would, though.
Sorry?
Dung probably would, though.
Yeah, true. But I think it comes back to this question, which is for me something that is usually hidden under the way this diagnostic sociology treats the problem with our world today, which is often just a problem with America social formation, which is very singular, hardly presented in a way that is distinct from other places. It's usually generalized too quickly, and these differences are lost. But there is something about this, I'm not sure what's the word we want to use, like a slow displacement and a kind of big debate on what is the category we should use to nail down this level of inconsistency that was inherited after I don't know how many 100 years of construction of the country, which, as I said, for example, for Lasch, seems like psychoanalysis gives you the key to connect family. So you have like the theme of community being worked out from the point of, family through identity, because psychoanalysis does give you that connection between a certain level of care structure that is communitarian, even if it's a small family, and that outputs a certain theory of identity, a certain operations for what identity, personality, social integration as an individuated being is. That's not what happens elsewhere. For example, if you take political theory in Europe, it might even bring psychoanalysis into the picture, but it's more Schmittian, like community is about enemy and friend. And, you don't go from family to the individual. That's a totally secondary issue. It's all about kind of big symbolic structures and what's left out of that symbolic structure, and took a different turn. And I do feel like there's a lot of discussion about culture, community, public space, identity in the States that I can't really understand, because I can't really understand what it is trying to latch onto. Like, what is this? What does, you know, community building, kind of social affinity means in the state, given that it has such a particular thing? I think you said it all, like when you say there is a kind of short circuit from community to commodity that doesn't seem to go through the state in the same way that we debate some things here, where, you know, kind of concentration of knowledge is more like enclosure of knowledge than commodification of knowledge. So you get a poor a kind of inequality across a population, but the form that it takes is more a state-like form of enclosure, monopoly, you know, domination that divides, than commodification. So you don't get that direct connection between commodification and community that seems, for some reason, that poses a lot of problems and a lot of crucial structures about American society that there are like all the common sense kind of talks about it, but the fact that this never stops being a topic and it's constantly recuperated, and it's now have a new wave of politicization that kind of goes through the core of that connection again. You know, it's identity, there is some type of value, discourse, and so on. It just a bit surprising in a way that it's supposed to be the most obvious thing, all these discourses about commodification and individualization. But if it never ends, it looks like the problem is even deeper, or the structure is even more complicated than it was assumed, right? And that would suggest, again, why it's so hard to preserve the differences when dealing with how this affects an American society, and what does then therefore cultural transformation that has interesting political effects means there versus elsewhere. You know, like these things get kind of they disappear a bit. So I'm wondering, like, if you think Lasch is particularly relevant from that point of view. He does seem to have a lot of insights that you don't find everywhere that do concern this. But yeah, this is like a big rant. I'm not sure if it.
Well, one of the things I think is interesting about the American intellectual milieu is, for God's sake, do we want to be Europeans? But we also can't be, like, in a very fundamental way. Our history isn't conducive to it. We don't have the same background. We're not a unified people and have never been. I mean, we fucking expanded the category of whiteness just so we could have something to unify around. Like, you know, and I say that flippantly, but I also think it happens to be true. Like it was this project to create an identity, a synthetic national identity where there wasn't one, and to make it, well, we don't share enough of anything to make it stick, so we're going to find some analogy to biology to make it work. And that's what we did. You know, and that's different than, say, the settler colonial projects in Latin America with the La Casa Raza and whatever the fuck's going on in Brazil, which to be honest, one time I'd like to listen to you about that, because I've been asked questions about it and tried to teach it. I'm like, I don't really get it. Brazilian racial politics is hard. Which I think is the way everybody else feels about American racial politics, as we also force it on them all the time. And I think what is interesting about Lasch, for example, when we mentioned the question of identity, you know, I think Daniel's right that that Lasch may be writing about the problems with wokeism if he was still alive, but I'm not sure, because he actually, for example, often finds the positive virtues that he thinks should be modeled for the working class in Black communities in specific. And that comes up in multiple books, including in footnotes in this one. So that's an interesting conundrum, and it's not something he entirely works out. It's always like some offhand observation, where he's like, well, if you want to see what positive reinforcement of like social roles that are not punitive, well, look at a Black daycare school in a working class neighborhood. You know, that's his example. over and over and over again. Also, the only political movement in the United States on the left that he doesn't pretty much just completely deconstruct, other than early socialism, pre-1921 socialism, is the Black nationalist movement. And that's it. And he's got critiques of it, but he seems to think it's the best political movement on the left that we ever produced. So yeah. And Daniel just said, and that is why his daughter is a historian on Black history in America. Yes. So yeah, I guess that kind of speaks to this. I think we could talk about the American problem for a long time, because I think a lot of this comes from the fact that we think we're special, that like we're sui generously unique in world history, and I think we have similar problems to most large empires. And I don't just mean like in the current Leninist imperial way. I mean, we're literally like a constantly expanding empire of liberty that gobbled up parts of another empire and bought other empires from France. And like in a very literal sense, even if you didn't, have this Leninist definition of imperialism, I mean, we took over most of a continent. Well, except for the parts that no one lives in, up north. And the only reason we didn't take down to Mexico City, I don't know if you guys know this, was because of racism. Because when Polk wanted to settle the Mexican-American War, one of the ambassadors in Mexico stopped him from claiming down to Mexico City, which he wanted to do. And the way he was able to sell it was that we didn't want all these brown people that we'd have to take on if we went much past Texas. So, our history is lovely like that. But, and that's one of the gaping holes in most American self-understanding is they don't know their own history. Like, this stuff is not taught to us. I learned, that this history in Mexico. I didn't learn it in America. So, even though we're brash enough to take the whole fucking continent's name for ourselves, but that's what we do. So, any questions?
Let me just present to you something that we've been working on, and just wanted to hear what you think. It begins with a brief kind of theoretical frame, but then it actually moves to a way of making a distinction that I wonder if you think it's relevant or not. Because I'm not sure if I don't think we had a chance to discuss this when we were doing that interview with you and talking about it last time. But one of the things we've been trying to develop for a while, and I think that a justification for it comes from, we only managed to formalize this and give it kind of a conceptual idea recently, but it was a motivation, was this idea that you can tell from this kind of what's usually discussed between, as you said, like, oh, well, there are societies where you have some elements which are not capitalistic included. So all these themes from dependence theory and this discussion of modes of production and social formations, that we needed something which treated this was kind of a Polanyi kind of approach, where you take these different modes of social reality or social interaction, rather than taking them as stages, you take them as a scaffolding. So you want to be able to distinguish. So you assume, I'd say, two axioms at once. The first is you always have these different modes of interaction at the same time. So affinity and gift logic, contract, property, and so on, and commodity exchange. This is, let's say, the Polanyi kind of triad. Many heterodox Marxists do try to analyze social formations by looking at all these things at once, rather than just saying one thing is substituted by the other. For us, this was a very relevant idea because we started making a distinction between very aligned social formations, meaning what happens at one of these levels already like feeds into the next. So, for example, to be very kind of schematic, you could say something like a modern citizen who is also, if you define him as a citizen, you already define him as a worker, you define him as a family member. These things align in a certain way. So you can even say that the propagation of constraints at the level of the economy or of value, they already propagate the proper constraints at the level of property and in law, and at the level of family, affinity, gift giving, and community formation. And you can have societies where these things don't align. So the constraints you need to pass along and negotiate with at one level, they don't match with the other levels. And for us, that's a more logical, almost cybernetic definition of what it means to be in the periphery. So you can tell the difference between central social formations and peripheral social formations in a very gradient way, because inside of the center, you'll find places where these are more misaligned and places where it's more aligned. But the overall aggregate structures will give you kind of a mapping of who is in the periphery, who is in the center. And there are good ways of connecting this to more classical themes of, well, if you have an extractivist economy in some level, or less social security, you need mutual aid, you need a logic of the state where there is still no commodity form. So these things will have to be misaligned. So these things kind of add up. But in developing this, one thing that springs to mind is that you can actually tell apart, for example, the different structures of and the different challenges of even the Black movement in Brazil versus in the States, and why the transit between these things doesn't work very well. Being very vulgar and schematic, it looks like American social formation is one where if you were to make the scaffolding, you would have to put the formation of communities. They are exported in some level and preserved. Then you have commerce, and then you have state coming in to mediate, make sure that that commerce works. That didn't happen in Brazil, where you have the state taking on the territory first, so commerce can happen, and communities will be whatever communities are on top of that. So you have a level of mixing of people from different places, and African slaves with the Portuguese who also didn't want to be here. Brazil is a place where nobody wanted to be here, and the people who actually wanted to be here were killed. So of course, you're going to get a scaffolding where the passing constraints at the level of community forming are conditioned by state and value constraints that are prior to it. Whereas in the States, it seems it's inverted. There is a level where the constraints of value are passed along by reproducing certain communitarian structures that were already there. So you have more clear ghettified structures, and immigrants preserve their own kind of niches in a way that doesn't really, they're not kind of dissolved into the social terrain in a way that we have here, where not every immigrant community preserves their basic kind of communal structure, right? So you get an inverted scaffolding because the main friction is between communities and value. So because even the type of slavery and the type of use of slave work and so on, and the way that native communities were treated there, you have a clearer point of friction between communitarian constraints and value constraints first, and then state coming in to manage this mess. Whereas in Brazil, communities are the way you manage the mess, because you first have people that are just officers of the state, and people who are treated as just raw material. They're not even treated as a community that is ghettified and preserved and to be managed, right? It's a state and value and economic problem first, and then we formed communities on top of that, in a way that when we want today to import kind of a race politics or the Black strategies from the States, where the Black community can keep some level of form, right? It means something totally different than what it means here, where debates about, I'm not sure if you call this in English, like colorism and miscegenation here are crazy. So it's very hard to make that transit, So I'm just taking this as an example, and it sounds to me very interesting that, when it comes to finding a prescriptive, positive example of a politics that does build on community in the States, it's the Black movement, the Black nationalism that will emerge for Lasch. But yeah, so I'm just throwing all of that at you and asking, okay, what do you think of all of that?
Well, so one of the things that I was actually thinking about as I was rereading Lasch is the lack of geography. Like he actually does kind of talk about the cultures of the United States in a kind of homogeneous way. There's no real division between New England and the South and the West. And I can tell you that's very felt here. And it's felt in the lines of ethnicity. I mean, one of the things that we can talk about in terms of the Black community is concentrated in different areas, but it's like either in the South, which is actually a community that isn't represented to you very much, because that's where you see rural poverty, and still to this day, actually, in ex-urban poverty, in say the Black communities in the South, as opposed to the inner city Black community, which is necessarily concentrated, both from its history, redlining, de facto and de jure segregation, etc. And in fact, that like the wealth gap between white Americans in aggregate and Black Americans in aggregates all comes from property value. That's actually explains all of it. Income barely comes into the factor. It is how much house value you have after debt, and whether or not you inherited it. And that explains most of the gap. So there's that reality. But there is a reality in which, until relatively recently, the Black community seems like a coherent political subject in ways even other minority groups don't. So, for example, people like try to talk about, people of color are Latin people, but like, do Venezuelans really get along with Chicanos? No. Like, is it just a matter of whether or not someone identifies as white, a white Latino? No, not really. Furthermore, like colorism exists here too, although we don't talk about it in that way, because there's off-white people like myself, who are, who we are white when we're dealing with the larger populations, but we're dealing with large concentrations of white people. They kind of look at us side-eye, like we might not actually belong, like maybe we're Jews or mixed race or something. And in my case, both happen to be true, but nonetheless. So there's that. And I think you're right that there's a way in which these communities were relatively stable before the central government really asserted itself. And one thing you have to remember about us, like, we didn't really have a functional central government until after the Civil War. Like, so that's 100 years of post-revolutionary history where we don't even have a fucking currency. So these communities were largely self-sufficient in a real way. And they had a history of seeing themselves as independent states. At least the early ones do. Now, the ones after the Civil War don't. But, yes, the only one that's there's only two states that were formally independent republics, California and Texas. But most of the states saw themselves as effectively little mini nations. And if you think about our size, it makes sense. We're about the size of European nations, our states are. So I think that social technology is very real. One of the things and one of my critiques of Marxism that I get from anthropology is Marxists don't tend to take social technology seriously enough. And it's because I sometimes think they don't read Marx on modes of production like well enough, because he talks about like how all these things still exist from prior forms actually do still exist in new forms. They're just redirected towards other forms of value production because the logic of how you organize it has changed, but the actual material is still there from the past. And when you just look at the broad modes, you don't see that. But like, there's a reason why Brazilian capital and South Korean capital and American capital don't really work the same way. And Marxists are shit at speaking to this. And I say this as a Marxist, but it's like something that I think is a real problem, because we often do not understand how the organization of relations of production are actually ordered different in different parts of the world. Conversely, I think that leads us to misidentify how identities are constructed differently in different parts of the world. And And oh my God, do we expect everybody to have our notions of racism, including the Europeans who, I mean, yes, Daddy, you taught us racism, but we made it something very different than you did. You here being Europe, not so much, Brazil. Sorry. But I don't know what we could blame on Brazil. I'm really at a loss. I feel like I should blame something on you.
Wait 10 years and you're gonna blame much more, because we're developing export level technologies of
yeah, that's true.
population control.
If the BRICS dream happens, you will be the alter imperialist. So that'll be fun. I can blame stuff on you. Yeah. But no, I do think this problem of the central state. I actually think about this a lot in terms of, and this doesn't really come up with Lasch except it's a deficit, because, like I said, when you read Lasch, you don't get a feeling of the differences in American culture. Like when he's describing the end of the New Left, you would think everywhere was Southern California or New York, and that is by far not the experience of most of the country. And I mean, a fucking normal liberal historian like Rick Perlstein, who writes about like Nixon land and what the actual political landscape in the physical landscape of the United States, makes it very clear that even Lasch's totemic approach actually misses a lot of what's actually going on, because he flattens the U.S. into a monoculture, which it could appear to be, I think, during Fordism in a way, but even then it wasn't really. Like, the industries weren't the same. I mean, the southern United States was barely industrialized. Like, we kind of skipped it. So, like, these sorts of things really change the way you read someone like Lasch if you read carefully. And I think, to bring back the world systems theory point about cores and peripheries, one of the things I find interesting about that is I've been playing with the idea of like nested peripheries and nested cores. Like, yes, the US is a core, but there's also, there are peripheries within the US, which happens to be most of it, actually, and then if you go into even, say, New York City, which is definitely part of the core of the United States, or Washington, D.C., which is a part of political core of the United States, there are peripheries within those places too. And there's a real bitter, and then I'll get to Rafael. Sorry if I mispronounce. I always get the RH thing messed up in Portuguese. You must make fun of me since I pronounce it all like it's bad Spanish. There is a way in which this is this is flattened out in the way we talk about this. And I think we do have to look at this in a different way, because there's a very real sense in which in American culture, for example, there's a lot of resentment at the quote red states for taking more than they give in terms of taxes off of profits, right? But what is missed is how much resource extraction and personnel extraction and even like movement of peoples to the cities, concentrating all this knowledge and wealth in these areas. And then those people in those areas are shamed by liberal policymakers for needing the help that they get, partly because everybody's going to these major metropoles to be able to do anything, and so there's no one locally to run this shit. That is something that unfortunately you'd think Lasch would speak to, because it is in the purview of the problems that he's talking about. But since he treats US culture kind of homogenously, he doesn't. And so this kind of nested view of like core periphery systems building on top of each other that you're talking about really does make it clear that that's part of what's going on here. And I think that's something Lasch completely misses, and he tries to substitute this psychological argument for seeing some of the dynamics of this. And it's something I've kind of thought about a long time. It's great you asked that question. I've been thinking about that in terms of anthropology a lot. I think a lot about like stuff that Marxists don't talk about enough, like kinship relations, the way state mitigates that. There's been this movement in Marxism lately to talk about the distinction between the social and the state in a way to me that's like I guess there's the Althusserian way of totally collapsing the distinction, which I don't think is helpful either. But there's this way of which, like, pretending that the state and the social aren't constantly in a feedback loop with each other, as if they're ever truly oppositional. They might be oppositional in, say, Brazil, maybe, but not here. They're totally in feedbacks with each other, and so it leads to a pretty big blind spot on how to do politics here. And I think that's why there's this kind of aporia. I know there is, one of your comrades who says that all aporias are fetishes anyway, because Marx says that all answers are already available to us once we have the material conditions to ask the questions. I just want to say that Marx is wrong about that, and I think that's bullshit. So that there are real aporias, and they manifest because we don't have an answer to them. So that would be where I would think this kind of way of looking at the scaffolding, the existence of, say, prior things that seem related to older modes of production or prior communal forms not going away, because they don't. Like the all is solid melts in the air. Well, it turns into a goop, but it doesn't actually go away.
Yeah. No, this makes a lot of sense, man. Like it's both points. I think that, first of all, I think that the way you put it now, I think makes a very clear kind of interesting research program there, because and that does have a resonance with things we've been discussing here, because in Brazil currently, but I think it's not a Brazilian thing per se, but we see it here, there has been a distinction in which I would say it's a kind of, one argument would say something like, well, we arrive at a certain new point in capitalist development, and what the social consequence of this is a level of amorphia or dissolution of a public space, and then it tends to go towards something which is either psychological or kind of weirdly metaphysical, where since you lost the ground, the lack of this social form for community building, public space, it's substituted either for a theory of individualized atomization, everyone is their little corner and everyone is concerned with their little identity, which points to something, as I would say, it's true insofar as psychic struggle is true, but it's homogenizing because it just skips every subtlety about the social terrain, how this struggle manifests itself in different places. And there is a different thing which I think we are kind of part of in a way, which is the idea that, well, the move from a project that was more homogenizing to a place where this, what we've been calling this misalignment between these scaffolding elements, which I think consequences could be very well defined the way you just did, like creates these weird nested structures where there is a propagation of peripheral forms inside the center. And this is almost like a weird fractal thing, because you can almost, for every center, you can find its margin, and there is a new tension there. What that entails is something different, because then you need to talk about a plurality of little forms rather than just an amorphous homogeneity. So there is a weird movement, a weird way of saving this homogeneous discussion, which is going from, we had this working class, it produced a certain level of social public homogeneity, we lost that, and now we have an atomized homogeneity. And then you choose a field that will be committed to the idea that you can kind of cut across all difference and go straight to that common underlying element again. But you will have the trap of that kind of downscaling I meant. So you move from social homogeneity to psychic homogeneity, so far as everyone is struggling with individuation, atomization, or whatever. What I think you just suggested, which I think it's very similar to what we've been interested, is the idea that no, when you lose homogeneity, you get heterogeneity, which means you're going to have to double down on the specific analysis of different places, geography. These things are going to become even more important, not less, right? You're not allowed to save this kind of position where things are just homogeneous, and therefore you can think the whole from your little point of view. So I think that does mimic, in a way, what you said, insofar as it almost also is a matter of substituting the kind of easy resource to psychoanalysis for a more sophisticated engagement with anthropology, meaning, okay, kinship discussions should be back in line. Like these things now are going to play even more kind of nuanced role that they played before. And I think that makes a lot of sense. And I even think you can then retroact this back on psychoanalysis, because the hope, I mean, I've been very interested in this idea. I think it has a lot of traction, which is if you look at when psychoanalysis emerged, like if you, going back to anthropology for a second, if you take Lévi-Strauss talking about what he called the atom of kinship, like the minimal kinship structure for you to be able to, you know, given any encounter with some other person, localize them with regards to where you are. That atom of kinship is actually bigger than the nuclear family. Like, it's more complex. You can't just have a family that's built of mothers, fathers, and kids. You need like the weird uncle or the cousin from a second mother, like as a unit. That's kind of a basic thing you need. And the problem is, the weird thing is that all the concepts that psychoanalysis deals in practice, like forget the theory and its explanations. Like if you look at the thing that people were telling Freud and Freud was worried about, it's pretty much people having the pressure to construct out of whatever material they already had in terms of representation, stories, whatever, to build up from a less than complete atom back to a social atom of kinship. So it's almost like there is something about modernity where you get less than a family, and then you need to build up. You need to create an additional kind of clutch to be able to complete that little schema, because it doesn't really hold as a one thing. And psychoanalysis is more, let's say, an effect of that kind of dissolution of. It's not a matter of the modern family. It's not. You don't need to hypothesize the family as the fundamental unit of kinship. It's not. Affinity is more fundamental anthropologically than consanguinity. But it's a funny thing, because you can then explain why we moved to psychoanalysis at the moment that this other thing started getting, like, you just get like classic, you know, history of the formation of European countries and so on, and what that does to these communal structures. Then you get the moment where this psychoanalytic theory appeared and why it was culturally relevant, because it did give you, let's say, it did make it legible that people are now tasked with an additional thing, which is, I know who is inside my family, I know who is outside, but families are not just made of who's inside and outside. They're made of who are inside, who are outside, and those who are neither here nor there. Like, that's not a problem for most community building, to know that you know who is in, who is out, and the crazy little people who you don't know where to put them. That's also codified. The moment that you don't have that, because you have less than that, you need to create alone your own explanation of where those people fit in your little psychic model. That's why there is no psychism needed to explain most community structures, because it was never a matter of your psychic structure. It just became once things got kind of cut off from a certain type of structure. So it's interesting that you can move to anthropology to make this more robust, and you can also retroact back on explaining historically why psychoanalysis was certainly chosen and why it seems to make sense only in places where community building is kept in check in some way. Then you think you prefer that tool of analysis over anthropology, I think.
You know, I have a troubled relationship with anthropology, in that I think it's the most useful discipline and also the one that lies to itself the most. But which, you know, is probably as far as a contradictory generalization, one of the better ones. But you're right. You know, I've read my Marshall Solomons, I've read my kinship studies. Kinship is not usually based on consanguinity alone, and consanguinity is not even usually the most important element. And one of the problems that you can see with Lasch, and Lasch has a focus on familiar relations, and he's really, like I mentioned all the way back at the beginning of this lecture, that he's really focused on the Oedipal struggle. He does not like the movements away from the Oedipal struggle to more abstract inferiority complexes. And later on, when he's in debates with other leftists, particularly Lillian Rubin, the American Marxist feminist, who points out that Lasch naturalizes the bourgeois family going back into history. And she basically says that that's only really available for most families in a very specific time period. And that's probably between like 1870 and like 1950 in the United States, and only really in places like the United States and Western Europe, even then. And Lasch tries to anthropologically normalize it to all of human history, which is a major problem. And this is more the homogenization that we're talking about, because he, like, you know, he's really going to view like Black social forms as part of this traditional family that have been broken up by you know, deindustrialization, deracination. But, you know, if you go to Africa to find that family, you're not going to find it in a lot of places. And that is something he does not really deal with at all. He even goes so far to say in one of his essays that, like, non-reproductive couples don't really count as families. So if you don't have children, you don't count, which I think is ridiculous, anthropologically speaking. So it's why I kind of focused in on this biologicalization that he takes more literally from Freud than, say, other Freudians and post-Freudians do. It is actually a limitation, and it hadn't occurred to me that that's part of this homogenization effect, but it really is, and I think it has political economic implications, and it's why I don't think he can come up with any answers to the problem he sees. Like, he does not have any answers. Now, like, look, I'm also one of these people who will say there are some problems maybe there aren't answers for, but it is very frustrating, because, you know, one of the things that you get in Lasch is a, you know, maybe today we overfocus on the queer experience, for example, but it's not even really in his purview of writing at all, except maybe as a manifestation of narcissism, you know, which was like the classic, you know, Erich Frommian diagnosis in the first place. And, you know, I don't need to, I think that's regressive as fuck, but I also think, like, there's a certain logic that really makes this, like, consistent with Lasch's position. And that's probably the last point I have to say. I'll respond to any questions you guys have. But
yeah, no, man, this makes a lot of sense to me. I'll have to think more about it, but it's yeah, even there's the 2 points which just to again on this, right? This duality, which is, as you said, I think you put it very nicely, that, you know, if the bone on the throat, the thing that keeps on returning, is this statement that the personal is political. It's a nice kind of way of posing an impasse, because it will point him back to a level of, okay, there must be a way that politics can seep into this kind of underground level. But the very idea of the personal, I mean, I would even say it's an interesting thing, because from Moss and other discussions on anthropology, the idea of the person is like a crucial category in anthropology. The idea is that, well, whenever you have concrete affinity structures in place, things get treated as persons. So the personal is political is not really a claim that look at the individual. It's actually a claim to look at kinship structures broadly construed in this kind of but under very specific conditions, the meaning of person becomes, you know, the meaning of, look at what happens at the level of the individual. It's a nice way of thinking about kind of how he sets up the right place to look with a weird presupposition that might tie his hands in a way, because then he will clearly be paying attention and saying, look, there is something new about feminist politics in the States, or all these things that require some new tool. Something has emerged with a new legitimacy. At the same time, he won't have the tools to give this a framing that is not kind of narcissism adjacent, right? It's interesting. I never thought from that angle.
Yeah, I think it explains a lot to me, just working it out, because I've been dealing with these critiques for years, but I think in this discussion's helped me put them together, actually. What I see is the problem with this politics, and why it is both so illuminating. I do think it's sincerely illuminating some things about the American condition in particular. I mean, I really do. But yet it doesn't really feel like it gets something, even though it's so much more advanced than most of the kinds of people writing this kind of book, and yeah, you mentioned the German theory. There's also just an American punditry tradition that I think is like the stupid version of the German sociological tradition, where you're just like, well, there's a thing, and that explains everything that is not happening right now. Where
Yes.
Behavior economics, or the breakdown of the family, or the clash of civilizations, whatever the fuck that means. It's you see this tendency, and I think Lasch, one of the reasons why I think why the culture of narcissism is so popular but also so confusing is it's dangerously close to that kind of book, and he's really frustrated that people read it as that kind of book, but he's also kind of doing some of the things that kind of book does. So it's, and it also made him famous and rich. I guess there are worse things, but and got invited to the White House. That's weird. But anyway, so Jimmy Carter apparently invited him to give a speech at the White House. This is a very strange time. 70s were strange.
Oh my God, I'd love to hear that speech. So, hey guys.
Yeah, it's very, very odd to go back and trace that stuff from the late 70s, and then yeah.
No, it's interesting because it actually, just to tie it back to something I mentioned before, like we've been having this really nice, I hope it continues, an engagement with the Communist Caucus, and they invited us to speak, and we had a nice exchange, and we a lot of us read their text carefully. But one of the things we proposed was precisely on this issue, which I think it could be summarized in two theses we proposed. One is, usually when you describe something as disorganized, it means you don't have the adequate tools to name how it is organized. And things don't resist you because they're disorganized. They resist you because they're organized otherwise, right? So there is a move to find the tools to this when things look that are just amorphous, probably because you don't have the means to make intelligible what it is that they're actually latching onto in terms of what's going on. And that's been a lot of what we've been engaged with. It's okay, we don't need a theory of organization as if organization is something you do and it is just a form people need to adequate them to. Organization is just the fact that people are always organized in some level, even if it is so they can stay at home and do nothing. That takes a lot of stuff happening. So if you want to know what's going on, you need to consider organization as a point of view on anything rather than as a type of activity. So that was the first thing we mentioned, that there's something about the idea of proletarian disorganization that should move, like the danger that it faces is treating, as if disorganization is like a bunch of individual molecules hitting each other in a random way, and then you choose your way of describing why we are disorganized, disoriented, and so on. Whereas in reality, we're always surprised at how organized people are, just not in the way we wanted them to be. That's the first thing. And the second thing that I think also speaks to this, which I think it's a new thing. I don't think we always needed it, but I think it might be another corollary of the same thing that we might need it today more than before, which is there is a temptation with, and I think this type of sociology is a really good example of this. It's a temptation that you should know the terrain before you do stuff. Whereas it might be the case that it's the opposite. It's because you don't know this terrain that you will learn something by doing something. It gives you a purchase of doing stuff, which is at least knowing where you're stepping, right? So there is also a consequence of this idea, which is perhaps you will only find out how things are organized once you go against them. Then they resist you and you say, okay, so there's something there. So there is a whole bunch of social phenomena now that people are focused on in the States that follow from the simple fact that there was the Bernie movement and something happened, something resisted that movement, and now we're trying to learn what is the structure of the thing that resisted this thing that we didn't expect it to. So I think that there's also a movement which I think it has an epistemological grounding even, which is the idea that, well, not only should we by a matter of principle assume that nothing is entirely disorganized, and when it looks that way, something is wrong, but also that it takes organization to kind of make an organization intelligible. So if you don't do something that puts some structures into kind of engagement with you, you won't be able to tell anything about those structures. It's just a theory in your head. It doesn't really mean anything. If you substitute it for some other nice model of reality that allows you to sleep at night, it's the same thing. Like, in practice, it doesn't change anything. So there's also, I think, a reason to criticize what Daniel called the methodology, of we can read the century through Freud or Nietzsche, which you might be able to do. I mean, sure, but what will you learn in the end? You learn something about Freud. You won't learn something about anything else. So there is a reason to criticize that, because there is something like a kind of map of what's going on that should come at the end of a political process rather than the beginning,
Yeah, just as a methodological distinction between me and Daniel, I often think the reception of a thinker is far more interesting and something to learn from than the content of a thinker, as weird as that may sound. But like, so for example, I'm interested in the way Nietzsche was read in 1870 versus 1910 versus 1970. That tells me a lot, but the content of Nietzsche, that just tells me what Nietzsche thought, like, and to some ways, why do I care what a German reactionary failure thinks? A brilliant one nonetheless, but that I'm not going to change what I think about what he is. And similarly with Freud, I mean, one of the things I was questioning when I was going back and rereading for this last night, I read, chapter 6 for like the 50th time, but I also read chapter 5 and chapter 7. And in chapter 5, I was like, damn, there's a whole lot of Freudian gobbledygook that like Lasch just takes at face value as if it's, the biggest one is like the concept that the infant feels like they're omnipotent. And I'm like, do they? I don't actually know that.
Yeah.
Like
Sounds like a moment in life of we might feel very much the opposite, right?
Right. It's like because they have total control. I'm like, no, you're in the womb, you have the opposite. You have no control over anything. Like, but I mean, so there's these massive extrapolations from like early Freudianism that Lasch was doing, and then conceptual extrapolations when I was like, well, these are quite interesting if I accept your first premise, but what if I don't? Like, and why would this be so, and like you, why would Freud have spoken to this time period more than because of this time period, we now have these questions that answers these eternal family dynamics, which I just, I don't know about you, but I haven't seen a lot of evidence for the eternalness of the Oedipal complex. I just, I don't see it. The whole wanting to have sex with your mom thing does not seem to run through all of world literature. So, it's a thing, and it's a real limitation But when I approach that, I try to contextualize Lasch too, because another thing that we often don't do is put these people back in their own context. And, you know, Lasch is the son of a fairly prominent journalist. He does come from a quasi working class background, but really he doesn't know that. And he is introduced to the world of academia pretty much immediately and is critiquing the left from that standpoint. And so one of the things you can actually say is he doesn't really have a very robust notion of what working class life really is, other than like a narrativization of it from an almost cultural perspective. So, and I frankly, in the United States in particular, you will see this where people are like, well, we have to go where the workers are, so we should like country music. And I'm like, okay, but one, those are not Marxist assumptions. Those are really like Pierre Bardouian assumptions about like cultural habitus and cultural capital. And while they may be true in addition to Marxist ones, I don't know that they help you very much. But two, a lot of times this stuff is just coded as working class and isn't at all. Like you drive a pickup truck, well, your pickup truck costs $120,000. Like it costs as much as a house did before COVID. So like that's not really a signifier of anything materially about class. It's a signifier of an affectation of wanting to look like you're from that class culturally, but it's not actually the thing. It's almost like a simulacra of it. And leftists will then see that in America right now and be like, well, we need to target that, or we need to ignore class culture altogether and pretend like it doesn't matter. And those are kind of the two false binaries you were presented with. I suspect this is more of a sign of the organized disorganization. This is really a resistance to something actively, even amongst the left itself. Like they don't want to see something about themselves. And I guess this is something where I do think, well, we need something much more fine-grained, much more anthropologically rich than what Lasch gives us. His instinct to say that you should not trust yourself on these matters is absolutely correct. Now you guys have eco post-leftism. Yeah, that actually sounds like the second wave of post-leftism in America. Anyway. All right. Well, we've been discussing this for a long time, so.
No, it was just like the related eco-indigenous, post-leftism, anti-Marxist, I mean, whatever wave it is. And
oh my God. Well, we had this big thing in the 90s where there's we had this big movement in the 90s where a bunch of former Marxists who became anarchists because they embraced indigenous critiques of Marxism that also ended like, we have to reject leftism altogether. And then a lot of them became primitivist and some of them became like primitive fascist even, like, and they were often in a feedback loop with like Mexican groups. So like there's this thing called Atasha that was like in a feedback loop with like these weird green terrorists outside of Mexico City. And you know, it was it was kind of a thing from like 1990 to about right after Occupy Wall Street, but it's definitely gone away now. And
that's
now what?
The second wave?
Yeah, that's what I call it, the second wave. I'm the only person who calls it this wave. This is like unique to me, but
no, I'm loving it. I mean, I'm just glad to learn that we are also on just following along on the American.
But you do it in your own way.
Yeah,
do it.
I mean, you guys should feel good right now. All of American leftists are basically like idol worshiping Lula. I'm surprised that we don't have statues everywhere to him. And Lula's one of these weird figures that both every far leftist loves, but also every fucking normie Democrat loves if they know who he is. And it's a very weird phenomenon here. Oh, it is? Yeah. But
it's kind of tailored for that, yeah. But I guess we can have if you want to report on that, we can agree on a day for a very weird.
I would love to talk to you guys about what the hell is going on in Brazil, because it's like we get it through very pink colored glasses. Let's just put it that way, where it makes it sound like Lula defeated all the reactionaries and everything is fine, nothing is bad, all is good.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, definitely not that. But yeah, for that depressing conversation, I think we would need another 3 hours.
Yeah,
By the way,
that's fair.
so much, man. I mean, it's not everyone who comes on and remains engaged for the length that you've had. Like a lot of people are after 1 hour of this weird conversations, just you can see we tired them way too much already. So thank you so much.
Thank you.
Well, I hope we can continue discussing these. They're always welcome to come whenever you want to talk about of these topics in more detail. I'm sure everyone would love that.
All right. Yeah, I will try to pop in sometime.
Great.
Please do. Please
Nice.
do. Please. It was great today. Thank you again.
Thank you, guys.
See you all. Bye.
Um,